Welcome to the Kentucky Leadership Development and Discipleship Academy, where leaders are equipped, disciples are strengthened, and your calling is developed for kingdom impact. All right, well, I'm going to invite you all to come back to your seats. Your fellowship sounds good, but it looks like everybody's had an opportunity to get some snacks and maybe get a cup of coffee. So we're going to jump right into our second session today, and we're going to be highlighting some of the principles from John Maxwell's leadership book, The 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership. Now, this book has been around for a while, so you may have read it. Some of this material might be familiar to you, but one of the things that I have found is even when I have gone through a book and read it, you can go back to that, and especially when somebody else presents on it and something may be highlighted that had not jumped out to you before. But if you've not read this book, I strongly encourage you to add it to your leadership library. John Maxwell is considered in both Christian circles and in secular circles as one of the leading experts on leadership. And he's done a lot of research and study about it. He has written many books about leadership, and some of those even share about his pastoral ministry journey. So we're going to examine some of the laws that he talks about in this book. We're not going to go through all 21 of them because that would take much more than a 1-hour session, but I'm going to highlight a few of the ones that I've found to be particularly helpful for me. But before we jump into the actual meat of the laws, let's make sure that we have a clear understanding of what a leadership law is. It's a principle of leadership that should be transferable in any leadership situation. So whether you're leading in the marketplace, or you're leading a small group, or you're leading a pastoral ministry, or you're leading a youth ministry, you're leading a statewide ministry, or you're leading in your career, your job in the secular marketplace, these are principles that are transferable to every situation that you find yourself in. And good leaders make themselves aware of the leadership laws that are tried and true and are tested, and they add them to their leadership toolbox. If you hang around me often, you'll hear me use that term, leadership toolbox. You know, when I go into my garage at home, I've got tools that I can use to hang up artwork in the home. I've also got tools that will help me do woodworking. That's one of my hobbies. I like to build things with wood, and those tools are different. And depending on the situation, I need to go to the toolbox and get a different tool. Well, leadership is much like that. And so today we're going to add some leadership tools to our toolbox by examining some of these laws from John Maxwell's 21 Irrefutable Laws. So the first one we are going to talk about today is the law of process. And we will talk about 4 primary things. We'll do a small case study on a woman named Ann Schreiber. We will talk about the fact that leaders are learners. We will talk about phases of growth in your leadership journey. And then we'll do another case study on Theodore Roosevelt. So let's start with Ann Schreiber. Just quick show of hands. Anybody know who Ann Schreiber is? I think I saw one hand go up over there. There's no one who knows, so we'll educate you about Ann Schreiber. She is a not too well-known individual. She lived a meager life by all accounts and accords in the early 1900s, and she worked for the IRS. She was a career IRS worker, and she was faithful, she was diligent, and over her entire career at the IRS, she never received a single pay raise. She never received a promotion, even though she was among the most diligent, and received a very meager salary of just a few $1,000s every year. But Ann Schreiber understood the law of the process. Even after she retired from the IRS, she lived on her Social Security check, never receiving a major financial windfall. But when she died, a university was shocked when she willed her entire estate to this university, and they opened the check to find that Ann Scheiber had left an endowment of $22 million to the university. Because Ann Scheiber understood the law of the process. Early on in her career in the IRS, she began to pinch those pennies and to save them and invest them. And over her entire life, she never stopped saving and investing. And now the reality is that if Ann Scheiber left an endowment of $22 million, that there was a significant portion of her life where she was a millionaire. And yet, when you study the life of Ann Scheiber, she never lived her life as many millionaires lived their lives. She didn't buy for herself lavish items. She did not live extravagantly. She wanted to compound the finances that she had so that she could leave a significant endowment. She understands that the small things that you do every single day really begin to define the law of the process. And many times in leadership, we want to be able to achieve the major thing, right? We want that Mount Everest moment where we're just knocking it out of the park. But most leadership, good leadership, a law of leadership, is that what matters most is what you do day by day over the long haul. The small decisions that you make with precision and with consistency every single day, they compound upon each other week after week, month after month, year after year, decade after decade. That's why perseverance and patience in leadership is one of the most important qualities that a leader and a pastor can have, because there are very few overnight successes. But there are many examples of people who did small things day by day, and over the years, it compounded and it resulted in a wonderful moment of leadership. And so one of the things that we'll talk about today is that leaders are learners. John Maxwell says, successful leaders are learners. And I think this is really fitting for what we're doing with the continuing education process in North America. If you're going to be a good leader, you have to be someone who is continually learning. It doesn't matter whether you're in ministry or if you're in the marketplace. The moment you stop learning, the moment you stop keeping yourself up to date on the best practices or the new things that are coming out, your leadership and your influence begins to slip. The law of process teaches us that growth in any capacity is the product of consistent effort over a sustained period of time. Leadership cannot be developed overnight, but it is the result of an attitude of learning that spans an individual's entire life. So I want you to think about events versus processes. Many times in leadership, we highlight the events. Some of the events that stand out in my life is when I got my minister's license at 20 years old. That stands out to me. I think about the day that I graduated with my bachelor's degree, the day that I graduated with my master's degrees. Those were events, but they were the result of a process, right? Those things didn't happen overnight. I didn't just show up and say, give me my minister's license. I didn't just show up and say, give me a bachelor's degree from Lee University. I didn't show up and say, give me a master's degree from Indiana University. There was a process that happened in the shadows, right? It wasn't front-facing to everyone in my life. It wasn't a very public thing. I mean, those who were closest to me knew what I was doing, the work that I was putting in, but it wasn't flashy. It wasn't showy. It wasn't like, oh, look at me. It was consistent effort over a prolonged period of time. And one thing of the things that we have to remind ourselves as leaders, and something that we have to instill in a new generation of leaders, is this law of the process. Good leadership takes time. And we also have to understand that this is transferable across leadership settings. So I can use myself as an example here. I've recently, in the last 2 years, stepped away from 8 years of regional youth director in the Great Lakes region. And now I am 3 months into state youth director of the state of Kentucky. The processes and the leadership capital that I had built in the Great Lakes region did not all transfer over to the state of Kentucky. Where I was at in my leadership journey in the Great Lakes region is not completely transferred over here. I still have all of the lessons that I've learned. I still have all of the things that were developed in me, but the position of leadership, while the titles are the same, I begin the process again in a new environment. And that can be a difficult thing for leaders to remind themselves of when they switch positions or they switch leadership contexts. That when you begin leading a new group of people, in many ways, the process begins again. The development of those relationships begins again. The development of relational capital so that you can actually lead begins again. And leaders should not be discouraged by this, but they should be encouraged by the reality, I have been here before. I know how to navigate this terrain. And if I am patient, and if I will be consistent with small things day by day, week by week, year by year, my leadership will continue to grow in this setting as well. And so there are phases of growth that we need to be mindful of. The first phase of growth is that we realize I don't know what I don't know. There are things in your leadership that you don't know. And we need to be able to have the humility to say, you know what, there are things I just don't even know what I don't know. I need somebody to step into my leadership context and be like, you are ignorant about all of these things. And ignorance isn't a knock against us until we act like we're not. When we act like we're not ignorant, when we think, well, I know everything about everything and there is nothing that I need to learn anything more about, that's when leadership stagnates. To have this realization, there is somebody out there that knows things that I don't know, and I need to get around other leaders because they're going to be able to say, hey, Stetson, I know you're working really zealously in this area. Do you know about this thing here? Well, no, I didn't know about that. Can you tell me a little bit more? The second phase is I know that I need to know. Once I realize that there are things that I don't know, then this hunger develops within me. I need to know more. I want to learn. I want to get better. This is to be conscious that you are ignorant of the facts is a great step to knowledge. That's what Benjamin Disraeli says. And John Maxwell says that being put in charge is not the same thing as being a leader. Oftentimes we are put into a position and then we need to realize there is much that we have to learn in this phase of growth. And then we move into phase 3, which is I know what I don't know. I can identify I don't know how to do X, Y, and Z. And so now I can seek somebody out who can teach me how to do this. I'll give another personal real life example of this. Bishop White and I recently got to attend ICM, and we had the blessing of traveling home together, and we started talking about sound equipment. And I told Bishop White, Bishop, I really don't know much of anything about sound equipment. And his face lit up and his voice perked up a little bit. He said, well, we've got some time. Let me tell you about some things that I know about sound equipment. And he began to detail for me and explain some things that I have been in proximity to, but did not understand. I knew that I didn't know. And I could look at a Bishop White and say, I know you know about this, and I don't know about this. Will you deposit in me some of what you know about this topic? It's where you identify areas and specific realms of growth. And as leaders, we should be able to pinpoint, this is what I'm working on in my leadership. If I ask you today, what are you developing in your leadership? A lot of people are going to go, that's a great question. I don't know what I'm developing in my leadership. And this isn't a condemnation on anybody, but if you don't know what you're working on in your leadership, find out. Okay? You don't have to have a list of 30 things where you're trying to grow. But where is the one area where you need to be intentionally developing the process of your leadership and growing in that area. Then phase 4 gets us to I know and grow, and it starts to show. And I'm going to share you some statistics that John Maxwell really lives by, and I suppose that you could argue them, but they've been applied to various contexts, and I think they stand pretty true. He says leadership is a 20-year journey. In 5 years into your leadership, you begin to see the impact of your leadership. Now that should cause us a moment for pause as well, because we want about 5 minutes, right? I want in 5 minutes to see the impact of my leadership. Well, if it's not 5 minutes, 5 hours. If not 5 hours, then 5 days, but much past 5 days, maybe we can stretch it to 5 weeks, but I want to see impact immediately. John Maxwell says real leaders are consistent, they are persistent, and they begin to see a significant impact in 5 years. Translate that to pastoral ministry. How many times do we have pastors who, and this is not a condemnation, but after 2 years, give up. After 4 years, give up. There are Christian studies that say that true and lasting church growth does not begin to happen until a pastor has been there for 5 years. Now, that is not always the case, but that's something encouraging to me as a young minister. As a young pastor, I'm almost 3 years into my pastorate at Church Alive. And I'm one of those guys where I want to see it happen. I want to work hard. I want to see it, grow immediately because I'm zealous about it. And I remind myself, Stetson, you've got to be in it for the long haul. Don't give up. We need to tell our young pastors, our young leaders, don't give up. At 10 years, you will be a highly effective leader. Again, translate this into pastoral ministry. 5 years, you begin to see the impact of your leadership, but it's not until year 10 where most people are a highly effective leader. And then in 20 years of leading, you will be able to teach others about leadership. And again, these are not, chiseled in stone laws. But when you've been doing something over a long course of time and you've been successful, it gives you the ability to invest into the lives of others. And then the final phase of growth is I simply go because of what I know. Leadership becomes a knee-jerk reaction. It becomes something that you don't have to think about, but it just happens immediately. Think about when you're at home and you walk into your bedroom and your bedroom is dark. What is the first thing that you do? You turn on the light switch. Do you have to think and go through the process? I'm in the room, it's dark. What should I do? Oh, I should turn on the light switch. No, you walk into the room and your hand immediately moves to flip on the light switch without this major thought process. That's that final phase of leadership. I really don't even have to stop and go through all of these different phases, but that's not something that we get to in year 1. It's not something we get to in year 2. It's not something we get to in year 5 or in year 10. This is over the long haul of leadership. And then he says your consistency in training allows you to respond appropriately in the middle of difficult leadership situations. And you will find that others seek you out for your leadership because of their difficult leadership situation. You know, or you simply go because of what you know. So let's take a look at the life of Theodore Roosevelt. And John Maxwell details this greatly in his book. And Theodore Roosevelt happens to be my favorite president. And there's been a lot of study and writing that has happened over his life. I want to share with you just a few of the highlights. When Theodore Roosevelt was a child, you may not know this, but he was a very sickly child. He was overcome with asthmatic attacks, and it was debilitating for him. But Teddy, as a young boy, decided that he did not want his asthma to be the defining factor of his life. And so he began to train not only his mind, but his body. And in fact, he is an anomaly in the medical world in that he actually trained so vigorously that he no longer struggled with asthma as a young man and as an adult, because he literally trained his body into submission. He took up boxing in college, and he was not the tallest man. He was not the most athletically built man, but he understood the law of the process, that if I train myself every single day, I will be able to stand out even among those who have more natural inclinations in these areas. As a young man, he studied the men who he wanted to be like. He identified those people who knew something that he didn't know, and he gave his life to studying them. He was a lifelong reader and a lifelong learner. Some will say that Theodore Roosevelt, every night during his presidency, read a book. Not he read a portion of a book, but every night after he finished in the Oval Office, he would retire to the estate and he would read an entire book in a single setting. He was a lifelong reader and a lifelong learner. When he was vice president, he gave 673 different speeches. Now, that may not be a staggering statistic to you in common days where we have airplanes and technology and people can give 5 speeches a day. This man was riding a train across the United States and gave 673 speeches as he was running for vice president. He finished a presidential speech with a bullet in his chest. During one of his speeches where he was running for president, a man shot him and the bullet was lodged in his chest. And he continued his speech. I think it was something like 45 minutes. The man continued his speech. And actually, his chest muscles were so large that is what helped stop the bullet from penetrating deep into his lung and causing a major health issue. He understood the law of the process. He led an expedition to Brazil at age 55. And he died in his sleep with a book under his pillow. And one man said of Theodore Roosevelt that death had to come for Teddy in his sleep, because if he had been awake, he would have put up a fight. This was a man who spent his entire life every day creating these habits, these routines, this process, and it shows. And he goes down in history as one of the greatest leaders. So let's pause there for a moment. What questions do you have about the law of the process?
What was the
The
book?
book? That's a great question. I don't know. I'd have to find out what book was under his pillow when he died. That's a good question. All right, well, let's move on to one of the other laws, the law of intuition. And we will learn in this section that everyone is intuitive. We will look at how leaders think, look at different levels of intuition, and we will do a case study on Steve Jobs. So let's start with the fact that everyone is intuitive. There is something that you are intuitive about. That means there is something that you are just naturally gifted in. I'm going to brag on our bishop for just a moment. Bishop White is naturally intuitive about musical things, right? He is naturally intuitive about the way things sound in audio development. It is something that he is naturally gifted in. Some of your wives are probably naturally intuitive about where to go shopping and where to get the best deals. They know which stores are going to have the best deals, or maybe they are naturally intuitive in decorating your home. I am not intuitive about interior decoration, but praise the Lord, my wife is. And so she is able to do some design around our house. But there are things in your leadership that you are going to be naturally gifted in, that you're going to be intuitive for. Your intuition strength may be related to communication. It may be related to organization. It could be related to design. But intuition in a leader is kind of that gut feeling. And we as Christians, and certainly as Pentecostals, we move even past just the gut feeling. And a lot of times our intuition or our discernment comes from the Holy Spirit. But the Holy Spirit also has crafted you with specific giftings, and he has wired your brain in a specific way to think differently from other people's brains. You need to identify in your leadership what your leadership intuition is, and you need to lean into that. You also need to identify where you are not naturally intuitive as a leader. in some leadership areas, and then surround yourself with other leaders who are intuitive in that area. Colin Powell is a retired Army general, and he is very famous in the United States of America. He was former Secretary of State, and he made this statement that he would only ever gather 40 to 60% of information regarding a specific situation or a decision that he needed to make. And then he left the other half of it up to his intuition, up to his experience, his former situations that he had experienced and led through. He didn't want to be overwhelmed by all of the information. He wanted to allow his intuition to have some play in that as well. And this is really the idea of sometimes we can have analysis paralysis, that we gather so much data in. And I want to hear your voice and 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 your voice. The problem is, sometimes when you listen to too many voices and you're dead set on getting a consensus decision, leadership begins to dissolve. As a leader, yes, we are to listen to the voices around us, but then at the end of the day, we've got to make a decision. We have to be decisive as leaders. We have to use some of that leadership intuition. I've heard what you've said. I feel this in me. And especially when the Holy Spirit is leading us, we follow the direction of the Holy Spirit, even when the voices around us are suggesting we go elsewhere. As we look at our leadership intuition, we need to understand that we should be developing a leadership bias. And I want to use that word bias in a positive connotation today, because there's a lot of negative connotation around the word bias. But today we're going to talk about leadership bias. And perhaps it's more beneficial for you to think about it through a lens of which you might see. I wear glasses, and when I take these glasses off, you are all blurry faces. And from here, I couldn't tell who is who. But when I put these glasses on, the lenses change my vision. They bring things into perspective and into precision. And as leaders, we need to be evaluating everything through the lens or the bias of leadership. Take H. Norman Schwarzkopf, for example. In the Second World War, he was commanded to take over the 1st Battalion of the 6th Infantry. And he was told upon arrival, and he had heard the rumors that they were the worst of the 6th. And the outgoing commander of this battalion literally told him, he said, they're lousy. They can't do anything good. They can't march together. They can't follow orders. They're sloppy. They're disorganized. Good luck. You won't be here long, because they are the worst of the 6th. The outgoing commander said they were lousy. The morale was lousy, but he did not realize it was because he was lousy. The commander was lousy. When Norman took over, he found out very quickly that the outgoing commander had not been to the barracks in months. He had not been to the training field in months. He had not been where the men were. All he was getting were the reports that they were lousy. And by all accounts, his evaluation was true. When he left, that battalion was lousy. But watch what happens. In 30 days, Schwarzkopf reversed the trajectory through intuitively making decisions and making necessary and quick changes. And that battalion went on to be one of the most effective in the 6th Infantry. In just 30 days, because of a leadership swap and a leader who was intuitive and said, this is the change that we need to make. This is how we need to get organized. This is where we need to have more systems and processes in place. He was sent there to fix a problem, and he didn't sit around and wring his hands. He used his leadership experience. In 30 days, they went from one of the worst to one of the very best, because he was intuitive. How you see the world around you is determined by who you are. You are a unique individual. You are a unique leader. You are a unique minister, and God has designed you intricately and with specific giftings and talents. Lean into the way God has designed you as a leader. Don't shy away from your talents and your giftings, but use them, leverage them as leadership intuition. So let's talk about how leaders think. John Maxwell says that because of their intuition, leaders evaluate everything with a leadership bias. And then he goes on to say that leaders are readers. And he's not just talking about reading books, although he does specify that we need to be readers. We need to be getting books on leadership. We need to be studying the Word of God. We need to be learners. But he also says that leaders are readers of their situation. Leaders must tune in to the dynamics of any situation they walk into. They must have the ability to sense the climate and the culture of an organization simply by walking into the room. You know, when I was principal, I had the pleasure of working with a very gifted school resource officer. And one day, as I was coming out of my office, he made a comment to me. He said, "You do something that nobody else in this building does." I said, what is that? He says, when you enter a new room, he said, you look to the left and you look to the right. He said, you scan the entire room. He said, most people don't do that. He said, that's something that we're taught as police officers to do. And I see Pastor Dallas shaking his head. Yes, he said, the first thing I do when I walk into the room as school resource officer, he said, I look at every person, I look at every door, I look at every window. I want to know the entire layout of the room and evaluate if something goes wrong. What is going to be my plan of action? Good leaders are readers of a situation. They come into a room and they begin to evaluate what is good, what is negative, what is the climate, what is the attitude, the emotion of the room. Because there are some people who can be gifted speakers, they are gifted at organization, they may be the best preacher you've ever seen, but they are tone deaf to the climate of the room that they are in. This is something that leaders need to develop. And for some of us, it's easier than for others. This is something I've had to be mindful of in my leadership because I don't naturally and intuitively always tune in to the climate of a room that I'm in. I can be so focused on the task that I want to accomplish that sometimes I miss the climate of the room. But leaders must be readers of their situation. Leaders are also readers of the trends. And I want to apply this and look at this through a biblical context and a biblical worldview. We do not shift the Bible based on society and based on the trends of society. The Bible remains the Bible. The truth remains the truth, and we never change the message of the gospel. However, as good leaders, we are readers of trends and how the world will best receive the message of the gospel. You know, we've already talked a little bit about COVID. In a matter of days, weeks at most, every church in the United States figured out how to live stream like that because it was necessary. People signed up for Facebook that had never had Facebook. Pastors who were 60 and 70 and 80 years old, they figured out how to get a tripod. They went on Amazon, they purchased the tripod, they put their phone on it, and it might not have been the best live stream, but in a matter of weeks, every single church just about in the United States of America, they figured out how to live stream. Okay, it was a trend that needed their attention. As leaders, we need to be aware of what is going on in the world around us. I was at a leadership conference a few weeks ago, and a statement was made that really stuck with me. The presenter said, read the newspaper. He said, but read the newspaper through the lens of the Bible. Read the newspaper. Watch Good Morning America. Watch the Today Show. Turn on Fox News or CNN or MSNBC, but digest it through the lens of the Word of God. Leaders have to be aware of what's going on in the world around us because it is impacting the people that you are leading. You have to be readers of the trends. Leaders are also readers of their resources. And sometimes when we use the word resource, we immediately go to the bank account, the financial statement, but that is not the most valuable resource that you have. And in fact, it's not even necessarily near the top of your list. You need to evaluate your people. What leadership resources do you have sitting in the congregation that you are ministering to? Again, what natural intuitions do the people around you have that you do not have? You know, one of the things that I encourage pastors to do that have young adults or that have teenagers in their congregation is to turn over your social media account to that young adult or to that teenager. Why couldn't we have a director of social media ministry be a 16-year-old in your congregation? Guess what? They know so much more about social media than you do. I am praying for a teenager to come into Church Alive so I can give away the social media ministry to a teenager. It's a lot of work for me, even at 31, to stay up to date on the trends of social media. But we need to be evaluators of the resources, the people that we have around us. Who is gifted in administration? Who's gifted in outreach? Who's gifted in hospitality? Who is gifted at greeting people on Sunday morning or following up with visitors after Sunday morning? Be readers of the resources, the people that you have around you. What are your physical resources? What unique qualities does your church building have that nobody else in the community has access to? Right? One of the things that we were blessed with a couple years ago at Church Alive is we were able to begin hosting an English learners class in our building. There was this professional woman who worked for JCPS. She was a translator there. She did some ESL classes for adults there, but she had individuals who were needing additional help with learning the English language. And she said, I've gone to all these other churches. None of them have any space. Do you have any space? Yes, we have a classroom that you can use. That was a physical resource. Didn't cost us any money, but we were able to say, yes, you can come into our church. You can use the building for an English language class. Evaluate your finances. Okay, while it's not necessarily the top thing on there, you do need to be aware of what your finances are and how you can leverage them for your good, and be evaluators of your teams as well. One of the things that we have to think about in leadership and in ministry is we don't necessarily just need a youth pastor and that one individual will minister to all of the youth in our church. We need a youth pastor who will lead a team of individuals who are primarily going to be volunteers. The youth pastor may be a volunteer, but they are going to lead a team of individuals, and we need to make sure that our teams are healthy. Leaders are readers of people. Who is for you? Who is against you? Have some intuition to sense curiosity, doubt, reluctance, relief, or anticipation. Learn how to read people in one-on-one conversations and interactions. And leaders are readers of themselves. And this is where it gets a little uncomfortable. As leaders, we must be evaluators of ourselves. And this kind of goes back to those other phases of growth in the law of the process. We need to evaluate, where am I coming up short in my leadership? Again, it's not a condemnation, it's an evaluation. Where do I need to get better? And then I love this statement. This doesn't come directly from this book, but it's another leadership principle that I just love, where it simply says, check your ego at the door. As a leader, when you walk into the room, on paper, you might be the most important person in the room, but in actuality, you're not the most important person in the room, right? I might be the person standing behind the lectern and giving the presentation right now. I'm not the most important person in this room. Because I can do this all day long, but if you aren't here, and if nobody ever watches the videos, I am wasting my time. I am not the most important person in the room. We've got to check our egos at the door. So there are levels of intuition, and we'll go through these quickly. There are those who naturally understand leadership. These people naturally sense leadership and have been doing it since they were on the playground. They were the ones deciding what game they were going to play, who was going to be in what position in Red Rover, and who was going to be the pitcher on the kickball team, and they have continued to lead naturally up through their life. There are those who can be nurtured to understand leadership. I want to be a good leader. I don't know how to be a good leader. Will somebody teach me to be a good leader. These people have a willingness to learn and improve their skills. And this category encompasses most leaders. And then there is a third group of individuals, those who will never understand leadership. These people have no leadership skills and no desire to improve. Okay, as leaders, we have to be evaluators of that in our church congregations as well. There are some times where we have tried to invest and we have tried to invest and we have tried to invest. We're not putting them out the door. We're not shunning them. We're not disfellowshipping them. We're saying, you know what? I've noticed this person, they don't have a lot of leadership skills. I'd like to invest in them, but they don't have any desire to grow in their leadership. So instead of continuing to pour into a bottomless well, I'm going to take that resource of myself and I'm going to pour it into somebody who has a desire to learn. Steve Jobs was a man of intuition. So let's quickly look at a short case study of him. He started in 1976 in a garage, and 4 years later, he had built a multi-million-dollar company, Apple. But then in 1985, Jobs was ousted and the company suffered for 12 years. They had hit a small depression, and so the board voted Steve Jobs out of Apple, and then for the following 12 years, Apple floundered. They continued to decline. It was bad. Jobs returned in 1997, and the first thing that he did was he cut 70% of their projects. One of the problems in Apple over that 12 years is they had become a scattershot company. They wanted to have their hand in everything, but they had not perfected or gotten precise with anything. So Jobs comes in and he cuts 70% of the projects on Apple's slate. He realigned the mission to individuality. He reminded them that we need to think about the individual who is going to hold our product. What do they need? What do they want? He then created a strategic alliance with Microsoft, and he found someone named Tony Fadell and who partnered with him to launch the iPod. And what did the iPod later turn into? Probably what most of us have in our pockets or our hands, or some version of it, the iPhone or a smartphone. And he did this in just a couple of years because Steve Jobs intuitively knew these are the changes that we need to make. And he did it with precision and he did it quickly. And there is this balance of leadership, though, that we have to be mindful of. Sometimes we know intuitively what needs to be done and we can run too quickly, right? When we intuitively know what needs to be done, the first step is to get people on board with us. Because if we come in and we just intuitively know, we're not leading in a marketplace, right? We're not a Theodore Roosevelt and a president. We are not a Steve Jobs. We're not a commander of an army battalion. Our leadership situation is a little bit different. And we have to get the people who are with us to see the things that we intuitively know. Because if we step into a situation, we're just like, well, this is awful, that's terrible, this needs to be changed, get rid of that, update this. Very quickly, you can ostracize yourself from the very people you were sent there to lead, okay? But it shouldn't diminish your intuition. You just need to be mindful of it. John Maxwell says in this chapter that the principles of leadership are constant, but the application changes with every leader and every situation. That's why it requires intuition. Without it, leaders get blindsided. And that's one of the worst things that can happen to a leader. If you want to lead long, lead well, and stay ahead of others, you've got to learn the law of intuition. You've got to learn how to be intuitive in your leadership skills, intuitive of the people around you. Okay, so what questions or comments do we have about the law of intuition?
I'd like to ask a question. What are some ways we can increase our intuitiveness?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, for me personally, when I recognize the areas where I am not intuitive, I want to get close to people who are intuitive in that area. And again, I'll speak personally, and I'll use myself, and I'll use Bishop White as an example. Bishop White is a very relational individual. I think we could all attest to that. He is naturally gifted in connecting with people. It is just one of the gifts that he has. Guess what gifting Stetson Harper does not naturally have? I do not naturally have the gift of connecting with people. It's something that I have to work at. And the Lord and I had that conversation when he called me into pastoral ministry. I was like, Lord, I'd much rather just sit in an office somewhere or be in a cubicle. And I'm an introvert. I'm not like, Lord, this is not the way you hardwired me. But one of the things that the Lord has challenged me in is to grow that relational intuition, that relational capacity. And so that was one of the conversations that I had with Bishop White when I came on in this role at the state level. Say, Bishop White, this is one of the areas that I need to work in. And just by spending time with Bishop White and noticing the ways that he invests into our relationship, when he sends me a text after a lunch and learn, he says, man, you did such a great job today. I appreciate you so much. You're such a blessing. I bet some of you are grinning. I think you've gotten similar text messages like that from Bishop White. And I realized, man, that really made me feel well. Oh, that's something I can do, right? I can be intuitive. So now when we have a leadership day or some event or just a Wednesday night service at Church Alive, to send a quick text message to one of my leaders, man, you blessed me so much today. I appreciate you so much. That has increased my relational intuition. And so we have to be mindful. It goes back to evaluating ourselves. Where do I need to grow in my intuition? And who can I find who is already knocking this out of the park? And I just want to spend time with them. I want to get close to them and see how they do things. It's a great question, Bishop. What other questions or comments or thoughts do you have? Thank you for being a part of the Kentucky Leadership Development and Discipleship Academy. Check out our other trainings, tools, and resources in the Academy to continue strengthening your leadership.